Vincent Castellano had built his empire on precision, control, and the absolute certainty that every transaction would conclude exactly as he intended. As the head of the most powerful crime family on the East Coast, he was accustomed to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it, without question or delay. So when the Omega he had purchased for an astronomical sum simply vanished from the secure facility where he was being held, Vincent experienced something he hadn't felt in years: genuine surprise. The Omega in question, Ayaan Blackwood, had been acquired through Vincent's extensive network of contacts in the underground markets that catered to wealthy alphas seeking rare and valuable Omegas. Ayaan wasn't just any Omega, he was a purebred from one of the oldest Omega bloodlines in the country, with genetics that promised exceptional fertility, intelligence, and beauty. More importantly, he was unclaimed and unbonded, making him incredibly valuable to an alpha of Vincent's status who needed an heir to continue his legacy. Vincent had paid $12 million for Ayaan, a sum that reflected both the Omega's exceptional pedigree and the complexity of acquiring him legally through carefully orchestrated debt arrangements with his financially struggling family. The transaction had been months in the planning, involving lawyers, medical specialists, and security experts who ensured that everything was handled with the discretion and professionalism that Vincent demanded in all his business dealings. But now Ayaan was gone, having somehow escaped from a facility that was supposed to be impenetrable, leaving behind only a cryptic note that read, "Some things cannot be bought, sold, or owned. Find someone who wants to be found." Vincent stared at the handwritten message, feeling a mixture of admiration for the Omega's audacity and cold fury at the failure of his supposedly infallible security team. Marcus Romano, Vincent's most trusted lieutenant and head of security, stood in the opulent study of Vincent's Manhattan penthouse, his face carefully neutral despite the magnitude of the security failure he was reporting. "Sir, we've reviewed all the surveillance footage and questioned every member of the security staff. Ayaan Blackwood appears to have had inside help, possibly from someone with administrative access to the facility's systems." Vincent set down the note and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city skyline. At 35, he was at the peak of his power and influence, with a reputation for strategic thinking and ruthless efficiency that had made him both feared and respected throughout the criminal underworld. The loss of Ayaan wasn't just a financial setback, it was a challenge to his authority that could not go unanswered. "How long has he been missing?" Vincent asked, his voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. 18 hours, Marcus replied. "We discovered the escape during the routine morning check. Based on the evidence, he likely left sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. Vincent turned from the window to face his lieutenant, his dark eyes reflecting the calculating intelligence that had made him one of the most successful crime bosses of his generation. 18 hours is enough time to leave the country if he had proper documentation and resources. Do we have any leads on his destination or contacts who might have assisted him?" "We're tracking several possibilities," Marcus said, consulting his tablet. "But sir, there's something else you should know. During our investigation into Ayaan's background, we discovered information that wasn't included in the original acquisition files." Vincent raised an eyebrow, indicating that Marcus should continue. "Ayaan Blackwood has an identical twin brother named Ethan. They were separated at birth and raised in different families, which is why Ethan didn't appear in our initial research. We only discovered his existence when we did a deeper genetic analysis as part of the investigation." Vincent felt his interest sharpen. Identical twins from the same Omega bloodline were extraordinarily rare, and if Ethan Blackwood possessed the same genetic qualities that had made Ayaan so valuable, he could potentially serve as a replacement for his escaped brother. "Tell me about this twin," Vincent said, settling into the leather chair behind his mahogany desk. Marcus pulled up files on his tablet, clearly having anticipated this question. "Ethan Blackwood, age 26, currently living in Portland, Oregon. He's working as a librarian at the university there, living alone in a modest apartment. Unlike his brother, who was raised in wealth before his family's financial troubles, Ethan grew up in the foster care system and put himself through college." Vincent studied the photographs Marcus showed him, noting the identical facial features, bone structure, and coloring that would make Ethan indistinguishable from his escaped twin. But there were subtle differences in their expressions and bearing that suggested very different personalities and life experiences. "Is he claimed?" Vincent asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "No, sir. According to our research, he's never been in a serious relationship with an alpha and shows no signs of having been marked or bonded. He appears to live a very quiet, solitary life focused on his work and studies." Vincent felt a predatory satisfaction as he considered the possibilities. If Ayaan had chosen to run rather than accept his fate, perhaps his twin would be more amenable to the arrangement, especially if it was presented as an opportunity rather than a transaction. "I want a complete dossier on Ethan Blackwood," Vincent instructed. "Everything about his background, personality, habits, vulnerabilities, and desires. If we're going to approach him, I want to understand exactly what kind of person we're dealing with." "Already in progress, sir," Marcus replied. But given what happened with Adrian, shouldn't we consider additional security measures to prevent another escape? Vincent smiled, an expression that held no warmth but conveyed absolute confidence in his ability to handle the situation differently this time. Adrian escaped because he was treated as a prisoner rather than a partner. If Ethan Blackwood is going to take his brother's place, we're going to ensure that he wants to stay rather than simply preventing him from leaving. Marcus looked uncertain about this approach, but he had learned over years of working for Vincent that questioning his employer's strategies was both futile and dangerous. What are your instructions regarding the search for Adrian? Continue the investigation, but don't make it the priority, Vincent replied. Adrian made his choice, and I respect his desire for freedom even if I don't approve of his methods. But his brother now has an opportunity to make a different choice, one that could benefit both of us. Vincent dismissed Marcus and spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the preliminary information about Ethan Blackwood, trying to understand the personality and motivations of the man who might become his mate and the mother of his children. The photographs showed someone who appeared gentle and intellectual, with the same striking features as his twin but a softer, more approachable demeanor. According to the background research, Ethan had overcome significant challenges to achieve his education and career, displaying a resilience and determination that Vincent found appealing. Unlike his brother, who had been raised with privilege and expectations, Ethan had earned everything through his own efforts and seemed to value stability and security above material wealth. Vincent found himself intrigued by the idea of courting Ethan rather than simply acquiring him through financial arrangements. The challenge of winning over someone who couldn't be bought represented a refreshing change from the transactional relationships that dominated Vincent's world. That evening, Vincent made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of sending representatives to negotiate with Ethan or attempting to manipulate him through intermediaries, Vincent decided to travel to Portland personally to meet the Omega who might become the most important person in his life. For the first time in years, Vincent Castellano was going to court someone rather than simply claiming them, and the prospect was both thrilling and terrifying in ways he hadn't expected. Chapter 2: The Approach. 3 days later, Vincent stood outside the university library in Portland, watching through the large windows as Ethan Blackwood helped students find research materials and answered questions with patient enthusiasm. Even from a distance, the resemblance to Adrian was striking, but Vincent could see the differences in posture and expression that marked Ethan as a distinct individual rather than simply a replacement for his missing twin. Vincent had spent those 3 days learning everything possible about Ethan's routines, preferences, and personality. Unlike Adrian, who had been rebellious and defiant even before his escape, Ethan appeared to be genuinely kind, with a quiet confidence that came from overcoming adversity rather than inherited privilege. He volunteered at local literacy programs, maintained close friendships with his coworkers, and lived a modest but seemingly content life, focused on helping others and pursuing his own intellectual interests. The challenge Vincent faced was how to approach someone who had no reason to trust a stranger, especially one whose intentions were far from innocent. Vincent's usual methods of persuasion, wealth, power, and implied threats would likely drive Ethan away rather than drawing him closer. This situation required subtlety and patience, qualities that Vincent possessed but rarely needed to employ in his business dealings. Vincent had considered various strategies for making contact, from staging an accidental meeting to approaching Ethan through mutual acquaintances, but ultimately he decided on a more direct approach that would demonstrate his respect for Ethan's intelligence while still maintaining the element of mystery that might intrigue the scholarly Omega. Vincent entered the library during the quiet hour before closing, when most students had left, and Ethan was working alone at the reference desk. Vincent approached carrying a rare first edition of a poetry collection that his research had indicated was among Ethan's favorite works, something valuable enough to justify a conversation, but not so extravagant as to seem suspicious. "Excuse me," Vincent said, approaching the reference desk with the carefully practiced confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention without appearing threatening. "I'm hoping you might be able to help me with some research about the provenance of this book." Ethan looked up from his cataloging work, and Vincent felt a moment of genuine surprise at the impact of meeting those familiar eyes in person. The photographs hadn't captured the warmth and intelligence that made Ethan's face so compelling, or the way his expression brightened with genuine interest when presented with an intellectual challenge. "Of course," Ethan replied, his voice softer and more melodious than Vincent had expected. "What kind of information are you looking for?" Vincent placed the book carefully on the desk, noting how Ethan's eyes widened with appreciation as he recognized the rarity and value of the volume. "I recently inherited this from my grandfather's estate, and I'm trying to understand its history and significance. I was told that you're one of the few people in the area with expertise in rare literary works." Ethan carefully opened the book, his fingers gentle and reverent as he examined the binding, paper quality, and typography. Vincent found himself fascinated by the concentration and expertise that Ethan displayed, a sharp contrast to the stereotypes about Omegas being valued primarily for their fertility and submissiveness rather than their intellectual capabilities. "This is extraordinary," Ethan murmured, his attention completely focused on the book. "It's a first edition of Thornfield's Songs of Solitude,
published in 1840. Only about 50 copies are known to exist, and most are in museum collections or private libraries. Your grandfather must have been quite a collector. Vincent watched Ethan's face as he examined the book, noting the genuine passion and knowledge that transformed his gentle features into something luminous and captivating. He was a man of many interests and considerable resources. Unfortunately, I don't share his expertise in literature, so I'm trying to learn more about the pieces in his collection. Have you considered having it professionally appraised? Ethan asked, looking up from the book with an expression of concern. A volume like this could be worth a significant amount of money, and you'll want to ensure it's properly insured and preserved. Vincent felt a flicker of amusement at Ethan's assumption that money might be his primary concern. I'm less interested in the monetary value than in understanding what made this particular work significant to my grandfather. He was a practical man, not given to sentimental attachments, so there must have been something special about this book that justified keeping it in his personal collection. Ethan's expression softened with understanding, and Vincent realized that he had successfully appealed to the Omega's empathy and intellectual curiosity. Thornfield wrote during a period of significant social change, and his work deals with themes of isolation, identity, and the search for authentic connection in an increasingly impersonal world. Perhaps your grandfather found meaning in those themes. That sounds like it might explain his attachment to the work, Vincent replied, though privately he noted that those same themes seemed relevant to his own situation with Ethan. Would you be willing to help me research the book's history and your grandfather's possible connection to Thornfield's work? I'd be happy to compensate you for your time and expertise. Ethan hesitated, and Vincent could see him weighing his professional interest in the project against his caution about accepting work from a stranger. I'd be happy to help, he said finally, but I couldn't accept payment for what amounts to sharing my enthusiasm for literary history. If you're genuinely interested in learning about the book, I'd consider it a pleasure rather than work. Vincent felt a genuine smile cross his face at Ethan's response, which confirmed his research about the Omega's character and values.
In that case, perhaps I could take you to dinner as a small gesture of appreciation. I'm only in Portland for a few days, and it would be a pleasure to continue our conversation outside the library setting. Ethan's cheeks colored slightly, and Vincent realized that his invitation might have been interpreted as romantic interest rather than simple gratitude. Before Ethan could refuse or become uncomfortable, Vincent quickly clarified his intentions. I apologize if that sounded presumptuous, Vincent said, adopting a slightly awkward tone that suggested uncertainty rather than his usual commanding confidence. I'm not particularly skilled at social interactions outside of business contexts. I simply thought you might enjoy discussing literature over a good meal, and I'd appreciate the company of someone who shares my grandfather's intellectual interests. The explanation seemed to reassure Ethan, who smiled with genuine warmth. I'd like that very much. There's a quiet restaurant nearby that has excellent food and an atmosphere conducive to conversation. Would tomorrow evening work for you? Vincent agreed to the arrangement, feeling a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the progress of his strategic planning. For the first time in their brief interaction, he found himself genuinely looking forward to spending time with Ethan for reasons that extended beyond his need for an Omega mate and heir. As Vincent left the library with plans to meet Ethan the following evening, he reflected on how different this approach felt from his usual business transactions. Instead of acquiring what he wanted through force or manipulation, he was being invited to earn Ethan's attention and trust through genuine interaction and shared interests. The realization was both humbling and exciting, suggesting that his relationship with Ethan might develop into something more meaningful than the purely functional arrangement he had originally envisioned. Chapter 3. The Dinner. Vincent arrived at the restaurant early, having spent considerable time selecting his attire and approach for the evening. Instead of his usual designer suits that screamed wealth and power, he chose a simple but well-tailored outfit that suggested success without ostentation. His goal was to appear approachable and genuine rather than intimidating, a significant departure from his usual presentation. The restaurant Ethan had suggested was a small, family-owned establishment with warm lighting, exposed brick walls lined with books, and an atmosphere that encouraged intimate conversation rather than performance. Vincent appreciated Ethan's choice, recognizing that the setting would allow them to focus on getting to know each other rather than being distracted by elaborate service or pretentious atmosphere. Ethan arrived precisely on time, wearing a soft sweater and dark jeans that emphasized his gentle beauty while maintaining an air of intellectual sophistication. Vincent felt his breath catch slightly as Ethan approached their table, struck again by the Omega's natural grace and the warmth of his smile. "Thank you for suggesting this place," Vincent said as they settled into their seats. "It feels like the kind of restaurant where conversation actually matters more than being seen." "That's exactly why I love it here," Ethan replied, relaxing visibly in the comfortable environment. "The owners are literature professors who retired from teaching, so they've created a space that celebrates the kind of thoughtful discourse that's becoming rare in our increasingly connected but superficial world." Vincent found himself genuinely interested in Ethan's perspective on modern communication and social interaction, topics that he rarely considered outside their relevance to his business operations. Do you think technology has made meaningful connections more difficult to form? Not necessarily more difficult, Ethan said thoughtfully, but perhaps more intentional. It's easier than ever to communicate with people, but much harder to communicate meaningfully. Everything moves so quickly that we rarely take time to truly understand each other's thoughts and feelings. Vincent considered this observation, recognizing its relevance to his own situation. His usual approach to relationships was indeed focused on efficiency and desired outcomes, rather than genuine understanding, which might explain why his previous attempts at finding a suitable Omega mate had been unsatisfying despite their apparent success. That suggests that meaningful relationships require patience and investment, rather than just compatibility and attraction, Vincent said, testing his understanding of Ethan's philosophy. Exactly, Ethan confirmed, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm for the topic. The best relationships I've observed are between people who take time to really know each other, who ask questions because they genuinely want to understand, rather than because they're trying to achieve some specific goal. Vincent felt a moment of discomfort at how accurately Ethan's comment described his own motivations for their dinner, but he also found himself genuinely curious about Ethan's thoughts and experiences beyond their relevance to his strategic objectives. What drew you to library work? Vincent asked, shifting the conversation toward Ethan's personal interests. It seems like a career that would appeal to someone who values depth over surface interactions. Ethan's expression became more animated as he discussed his work and passion for helping people access information and knowledge. I love the moment when someone finds exactly the resource they need to answer a question or solve a problem. There's something magical about connecting people with information that can change their understanding or improve their circumstances. Vincent found himself fascinated by Ethan's enthusiasm and the genuine satisfaction he seemed to derive from helping others. In Vincent's world, information was primarily valued as a source of power and advantage over competitors, but Ethan viewed knowledge as something to be shared generously for the benefit of everyone. Do you have aspirations beyond library work? Vincent asked. Other goals or dreams you're working toward? Ethan considered the question carefully before responding. I'd eventually like to pursue a doctorate in literary history and perhaps teach at the university level, but I'm in no hurry to change my current situation. I've learned to appreciate stability and incremental progress rather than dramatic life changes. Vincent noted the emphasis on stability, recognizing that Ethan's background in foster care had likely taught him to value security and predictability above the excitement and uncertainty that Vincent thrived on in his business dealings. That's a mature perspective, Vincent said. Many people our age seem constantly restless, always looking for something bigger or more exciting rather than finding satisfaction in their current circumstances. I spent enough years not knowing where I'd be living next month or whether I'd have resources for basic needs, Ethan explained. Now that I have independence and security, I don't take those things for granted. Vincent felt a pang of something that might have been guilt as he considered how his plans for Ethan would disrupt the stability and independence that clearly meant so much to the Omega. For the first time since learning about Ethan's existence, Vincent questioned whether pursuing him was fair, regardless of how carefully he approached the situation. As their conversation continued over dinner, Vincent found himself increasingly impressed by Ethan's intelligence, empathy, and thoughtful approach to life. But he also recognized that these qualities made Ethan exactly the kind of person who deserved honesty and respect rather than manipulation, even well-intentioned manipulation. Can I ask you something personal? Vincent said as they shared dessert. Do you ever feel lonely, living alone and focusing so much on your career? Don't you want companionship or partnership? Ethan's cheeks colored slightly, but he answered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Sometimes I do feel lonely, especially when I see my friends in happy relationships. But I've also learned to be content with my own company, and I'd rather be alone than in a relationship that didn't offer genuine connection and mutual respect. What would it take for someone to earn your trust and affection? Vincent asked, genuinely curious about Ethan's standards and expectations. Honesty, Ethan replied without hesitation. Patience, someone who was interested in me as a person rather than just what I could provide for them, and someone who respected my autonomy and independence, even within a committed relationship. Vincent felt his heart sink as he realized that his current approach, however well-intentioned, violated every one of Ethan's stated requirements for a meaningful relationship. He was being dishonest about his identity and motivations. He was pursuing Ethan primarily for what he could provide, and his ultimate goal was to convince Ethan to give up his independence and join Vincent's world. Those seem like reasonable expectations, Vincent said, though privately, he was grappling with the recognition that he was fundamentally unsuited to be the kind of partner Ethan deserved. As the evening wound down, Vincent walked Ethan back to his apartment, both of them reluctant to end a conversation that had been more engaging and meaningful than either had expected. When they reached Ethan's building, there was a moment of awkward uncertainty about how to conclude their time together. I really enjoyed this evening, Ethan said, his sincerity evident in his expression and tone. It's been a long time since I've had such a stimulating conversation with someone new. I feel the same way, Vincent replied, and was surprised to realize that his response was completely honest. I hope we can continue our discussion about your grandfather's book, and perhaps explore some of the other topics we touched on tonight. Ethan agreed to meet again before Vincent's supposed departure from Portland, and they exchanged contact information with the tentative plans for another dinner later in the week. As Vincent watched Ethan disappear into his building, he found himself facing a moral dilemma he hadn't anticipated when he decided to pursue Adrian's twin. Vincent returned to his hotel room that night, deeply conflicted about his intentions toward Ethan. His original plan had been to court the Omega long enough to convince him to leave Portland and join Vincent's life in New York, where Ethan would gradually learn about Vincent's true identity and role in organized crime. Vincent had assumed that by the time Ethan discovered the truth, he would already be emotionally invested enough to accept the situation. But their dinner conversation had revealed Ethan to be exactly the kind of person who valued honesty, autonomy, and genuine connection above security or material comfort. Deceiving someone with those values felt fundamentally wrong, even if Vincent's ultimate intentions were to provide Ethan with a life of luxury and protection. Vincent spent the night wrestling with the question of whether to continue his deception or to find some way to be honest with Ethan about his identity and desires, even if honesty meant losing any chance of a relationship with the remarkable Omega who had already begun to capture his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Chapter 4: Growing Attraction. Over the next week, Vincent found excuses to extend his stay in Portland, ostensibly to continue researching his grandfather's book collection, but actually to spend more time with Ethan. They met for lunch in quiet cafes, took long walks through the city's parks and bookshops, and had increasingly personal conversations that revealed depths to both their personalities that neither had expected to share with someone they'd known for such a short time. Vincent discovered that Ethan possessed a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable, a passionate advocacy for social justice issues that had grown from his experiences in foster care, and a surprising resilience that had allowed him to build a meaningful life despite significant early disadvantages. Ethan, for his part, seemed intrigued by Vincent's apparent sophistication and worldliness, though he occasionally asked questions that suggested he sensed there were aspects of Vincent's background that didn't quite align with his story about inheriting his grandfather's book collection. "You seem to know a lot about rare books and art for someone who claims to have no expertise in your grandfather's collecting interests," Ethan observed one afternoon as they browsed through a vintage bookshop together. "And you have opinions about wine and restaurants that suggest considerable experience with expensive tastes." Vincent felt a moment of panic at being caught in inconsistencies, but he tried to maintain his cover story while addressing Ethan's observations. "My grandfather was an influential man in business circles, so I was exposed to certain cultural experiences growing up, even if I didn't share his specific intellectual passions. I suppose I absorbed more than I realized at the time." Ethan seemed to accept this explanation, but Vincent noticed that he appeared to be paying closer attention to Vincent's background stories and occasionally asked follow-up questions that suggested he was either naturally curious or beginning to suspect that Vincent wasn't entirely who he claimed to be. Despite these moments of tension, Vincent found himself genuinely enjoying Ethan's company in ways that had nothing to do with his original objectives. Ethan was intelligent without being pretentious, kind without being naive, and possessed a quiet strength that Vincent found deeply attractive. More significantly, Ethan seemed to bring out aspects of Vincent's personality that had been dormant for years: a capacity for gentleness, an appreciation for simple pleasures, and a desire for emotional intimacy that went beyond physical attraction or strategic alliance. Vincent also noticed that Ethan seemed to be developing feelings for him, despite his cautious nature and stated preferences for taking relationships slowly. Ethan's smiles became warmer and more frequent. He initiated physical contact through casual touches and longer hugs, and he began sharing more personal details about his dreams, fears, and experiences. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront after dinner, Ethan surprised Vincent by taking his hand and intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt both natural and significant. "I have to admit something," Ethan said, his voice soft in the cool evening air. "When you first approached me in the library, I assumed you were just another wealthy collector looking for professional expertise. But spending time with you has been—" Vincent felt his heart racing at the implications of Ethan's words, but also a deepening sense of guilt about the deception that underlay their entire relationship. "Unexpected how?" "You're not what I expected from someone with your background," Ethan replied thoughtfully. "You listen more than you talk. You ask questions that suggest you're genuinely interested in understanding different perspectives, and you seem to value the same things I do: meaningful conversation, authentic connection, simple pleasures rather than flashy experiences." Vincent squeezed Ethan's hand, moved by the assessment, but also aware of how inaccurate it was in relation to his usual personality and lifestyle. "Maybe being here with you has brought out aspects of myself that I don't often have opportunities to express." "That's what I was hoping you'd say," Ethan replied, stopping to face Vincent directly. "Because I've been wondering if what I'm feeling is just attraction to an idealized version of you, or if there's something real here that could develop into something more significant." Vincent felt the weight of Ethan's honesty and trust, knowing that he was being offered something precious by someone who clearly didn't give his affection lightly. The ethical thing to do would be to confess his deception immediately, but Vincent found himself terrified of losing what they were building together. "What are you feeling?" Vincent asked instead, hoping to buy time while he figured out how to handle the moral complexity of his situation. Ethan's cheeks colored slightly, but he maintained eye contact as he answered. I'm falling for you, he said simply, which scares me because it's happening faster than I usually allow myself to feel anything, and because I get the sense that there are things about your life that you haven't shared with me yet. Vincent felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach by the combination of Ethan's declaration and his astute observation about Vincent's hidden circumstances. What makes you think I'm not being completely honest with you? Little things, Ethan replied, not accusingly but with the careful observation skills that made him good at his job. You never mentioned specific details about your family or your work. You seem very comfortable in expensive restaurants and cultural venues, and sometimes you react to situations with a confidence that suggests you're used to being in control of complex circumstances. Vincent realized that his efforts to appear genuine and approachable had been only partially successful, and that Ethan's intelligence and emotional awareness made him a difficult person to deceive, even with the best intentions. Would it change how you feel about me if you learned that my background is more complicated than I've indicated? Vincent asked, trying to gauge how Ethan might react to learning the truth about his identity and circumstances. Ethan considered the question seriously before responding. It would depend on why you felt you needed to hide things from me, and whether the parts of yourself you've shown me are genuine or just another form of performance. Vincent felt a flash of hope at this response, recognizing that Ethan might be more understanding than he'd expected if the truth were presented in the right context. What if I told you that everything I've shared about my thoughts, feelings, and reactions to you has been completely honest, but that I've been less than forthcoming about my professional life and family circumstances? Then I'd want to understand why you felt those things needed to be kept secret, Ethan replied. And I'd want to know whether being honest about them would change the dynamic between us in ways that would make a real relationship impossible. Vincent took a deep breath, recognizing that he was at a crossroads that would determine not only the future of his relationship with Ethan, but also his own integrity and self-respect. He could continue the deception and risk Ethan discovering the truth in a way that would destroy any possibility of trust between them. Or he could be honest and risk losing Ethan immediately, but with the possibility of building something real based on truth rather than manipulation. If I asked you to trust me for just a little longer while I figure out how to explain some complicated circumstances, would you be willing to do that? Vincent asked, recognizing that he was asking for something significant without offering much in return. Ethan studied Vincent's face for a long moment before responding. How much longer? Give me until this weekend, Vincent said. I promise I'll tell you everything, and you can decide whether what we have is worth continuing despite the complications I haven't mentioned yet. Ethan nodded slowly, though Vincent could see uncertainty and concern in his expression. Okay, but Vincent, if whatever you're hiding is something that would hurt me or put me in danger, I need you to tell me now rather than waiting until the weekend. Vincent felt his chest tighten at the mention of danger, recognizing that his world did indeed pose risks that Ethan couldn't possibly anticipate. I would never intentionally put you in harm's way, he said, which was true even if it didn't address the broader safety implications of being involved with someone in his position. As they walked back toward Ethan's apartment, both of them were quiet, lost in their own thoughts about the conversation they'd just had and its implications for their developing relationship. Vincent knew that he had perhaps 3 days to figure out how to tell Ethan the truth in a way that might preserve what they were building together, while Ethan seemed to be preparing himself for revelations that might fundamentally change his understanding of the man he was falling in love with. Vincent went to bed that night, knowing that he had reached the point where continuing his deception would be unforgivable, but terrified that honesty might cost him the first genuine emotional connection he'd experienced in years. Chapter 5: The Truth Revealed. Vincent spent the next 3 days in careful preparation for what he knew would be the most important conversation of his life. He arranged for additional security in Portland, not because he expected immediate danger, but because he wanted to ensure that Ethan would be protected regardless of how their conversation concluded. He also consulted with his most trusted advisors about the safest way to reveal his identity to someone outside his organization, though he was careful not to reveal why this particular disclosure was so personally significant to him. On Friday evening, Vincent invited Ethan to dinner at his hotel suite, explaining that he wanted privacy for their important conversation. Ethan agreed, though Vincent could see nervousness and anticipation in his expression that suggested he was preparing himself for significant revelations. Vincent had arranged for a private chef to prepare a simple but elegant meal that could be served and then left alone, ensuring that they would have complete privacy for their discussion. He had also prepared a folder containing newspaper articles, legal documents, and photographs that would help explain his identity and circumstances in a way that emphasized his legitimate business interests rather than his more questionable activities. When Ethan arrived at the suite, Vincent could see him taking in the luxury of the accommodations with new understanding that his previous assessment of Vincent's wealth and status had been significant underestimations. This is quite a hotel room, Ethan observed, settling into the sitting area that Vincent had arranged for their conversation. I'm beginning to understand that your family's resources are more extensive than you initially indicated. Vincent poured wine for both of them, his hands steady despite his internal nervousness. That's one of the things I need to be honest with you about. My name is Vincent Castellano, and I'm the head of one of the largest business organizations on the East Coast.
Ethan accepted the wine but didn't drink, his attention focused entirely on Vincent's words. What kind of business organization? Vincent had rehearsed this part of the conversation extensively, knowing that the way he framed his activities would significantly influence Ethan's reaction. My family has been involved in various enterprises for several generations, including real estate development, import-export operations, waste management, and financial services. Some of our business methods operate in gray areas of legality, and we have a reputation for being very protective of our interests and territory. Ethan set down his wine glass, his expression becoming more guarded as he processed the implications of Vincent's careful wording. When you say protective of your interests, what exactly do you mean? Vincent took a deep breath, recognizing that he couldn't continue to speak in euphemisms if he wanted Ethan to understand and trust him. My organization uses intimidation and sometimes violence to resolve business disputes and maintain control over our operations. We operate outside the law when necessary, though we try to minimize activities that would bring unwanted law enforcement attention. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his face pale as he absorbed what Vincent had just revealed. You're telling me that you're involved in organized crime, that you're what people would call a crime boss? Yes, Vincent confirmed, appreciating Ethan's direct summary of the situation. Though I prefer to think of myself as someone who operates in the spaces between legal and illegal business practices, focusing on enterprises that serve market needs that legitimate businesses can't or won't address. Ethan stood up from his chair and walked to the window, his back to Vincent as he clearly struggled to process this information. Why are you telling me this, and why now? Vincent joined Ethan at the window, maintaining some distance but wanting to be close enough for Ethan to see his expression as he explained his motivations. Because I've developed genuine feelings for you, and I realize that any relationship built on lies would ultimately be meaningless. I wanted you to understand who I really am before you decide whether what we have is worth pursuing. Ethan turned to face Vincent, his expression mixing hurt